Buck, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you on. This is your expertise and all that you do. I'm really curious to see where this conversation goes, and
Yeah,
it's a big interest for me. I've talked about it a little bit on this podcast before, so I'm looking forward to this.
great.
Um, Before we dive in, for the listeners and everyone who's tuning in today, how can people how can what's your story? How did you get into what you're doing today?
Yeah, I started out as a medical doctor, and with surgical training, everywhere, everything from like neurosurgery. I did head and neck surgery, and I even ended up doing some cosmetics. I have a little bit of a. I realized I was an entrepreneur more than a physician, so I only practiced for a few years, and the next thing you know, I was off to the races and started some businesses, and actually got into the financial services space where I actually have done pretty well. And that is all. That's been a great ride, even for the last 7 or 8 years. But what the biggest thing for me is like, I've never lost touch with the science and the biochemistry and all the things that I loved before. And I got divorced about 4 or 5 years ago, and I realized I was just fat and out of shape and in my mid 40s, and I looked in the mirror and I'm like, what the heck just happened to me? Um, that's when I really went on this journey of health and fitness, and I really dug into the literature. And the thing I realized was in the biochemistry, molecular biology literature, which is my background. Um, there was these huge advancements I didn't really even know were happening in the space of longevity science. And that got me super thrilled because as somebody who was starting over, the idea of really being able to start over and not feel like the time was ticking was fabulous. And so that's where I went down this road. And before you know it, I started my own longevity type podcast. And again, for me, it's just sharing what I know, my journey. I've already kind of done what I need to do in my life for money and all that kind of stuff. And really, it's just exciting stuff that I want to share and continue to work on myself.
I love that, man. And
Yeah,
longevity is a very fascinating world. I've been dabbing into it a little bit the last few years,
yeah,
and I'm just like, this is really cool where things are
yes,
heading.
it is.
What was one of the first things what was your first thing that you dived into when it came to longevity?
Yeah, I discovered David Sinclair's work, and specifically the idea of the theory of loss of information, or the information theory on aging. And what I found fascinating about that is, and the aha moment is sort of, well, we never think about aging as a disease, and the reason for that is that anything that more than 50% of the population gets, it just doesn't count as a disease. And everybody ages, pretty much everybody ages if you're lucky. And so that's what was happening. But the paradigm shifted, I think. The paradigm has shifted, I think. We're starting to see that what happens in the aging process has a specific pathophysiology behind it. And like anything in medicine, if we know how it works, then we can start attacking the problem itself. And we know what causes cardiovascular disease. So we can target cardiovascular disease specifically. And so, with the same type of thinking, we can target aging now. And we've just become, we've really just started that journey. And that was sort of the aha moment.
What is something that, and I know there's a lot of variables to this, but what is some
Yeah.
of the things that um, have us age? Like, what's one of if you could share one or two core
Yeah.
things that you've seen in your research or in the research studies, like here's one or two big things that causes the aging process.
I'll explain the information theory in as simple language as I can. Um, So everybody has, genes, right? We have DNA. Everybody's heard of that. And basically, you can think of that as sort of a code, like an alphabet that's spelling out words. And those words individually have meaning, and that meaning is the expression of the genes, right? And so between those words, though, there is additional code. If we think about that as an alphabet, maybe you have a word and then another word, and then there's a space between that, right? The way the way that space between the words has been viewed in the past when it comes to DNA is that it's not very particularly useful, that it doesn't have any purpose. It's just kind of garbage language, right? Garbage code. But I think what the big moment for the current theory that Sinclair has is that space between the words, the space between the genes, which is called the epigenome. You may have heard that term, the epigenetics. That actually has tremendous importance, because what that space does, what that code does, is it tells someone how to read the actual words themselves. And so if that gets disrupted, then the words themselves get disrupted over time and don't get read with the proper enunciation. Hopefully that gives you a decent sort of analogy of what I'm talking about. But that is effectively aging. That code in between, the epigenetics, as we age, starts to develop various biochemical changes on them. For example, where you may have heard the term DNA methylations, things like that. They accumulate sort of this junk and makes it so the rest of the code does not get expressed with such clarity. And when that happens, that is aging. And so, again, that's sort of the big idea here. And there's plenty of scientific evidence now that if you can reverse those changes between those words, the epigenome, the changes, the chemical changes on the epigenome, that you can actually reverse aging. And it's being done in laboratory animals now. It's not a theoretical thing anymore. We've not done it in humans, but it's been done in animals. So this is not, pie in the sky, dreamy thinking at all.
I love it. No, it is fascinating. Epigenetics, I've been around for a long time. Well, I've been
Yeah.
studying for quite some time, and it is a very fascinating field to really of how what plays a role on that. Because I'm assuming then with just from my understanding of epigenetics too, it's like the environment plays a huge role on that,
Oh yeah,
and what
absolutely.
an individual's in. Um, People may be listening like, wait a minute, there's rat, you're doing it in lab now, we can stop the aging process. Let's hear more about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what are some of the methods that are being utilized as of now in lab?
Yeah. Well, in the lab, so what we know is there's a big series of experiments where there's a Japanese scientist with the last name Yamanaka back about 10, 15 years ago that showed that there's various genes that are within us called Yamanaka. We call them Yamanaka factors now. And what those genes can do is they can effectively reverse the age of a cell. I don't want to go into too much detail on that, but that because it gets a little bit deep into the science. But net, basically, what the idea is that these Yamanaka factors, if they are turned on, can potentially reverse the age of cells. And part of that age reversal ends up becoming this cleaning up of the epigenome. That is sort of the basis of right now in terms of some of the therapies that are going on. Sinclair has shown again in animals that you can actually reverse epigenetic age like that, and actually in human cells you can do it as well. Now, what's interesting is the way this has been done in various labs has been by genetic manipulation, right? By going on and turning on expression of those genes by delivering various genes to the target. But what Sinclair's been showing in the lab recently is that you can actually turn those, it seems that you can turn those genes on with some various drug cocktails as well. And that's where it gets really exciting, right? Then it becomes like, well, this isn't just like you have to, change, you have to like inject genes in your body, which sounds like kind of excessive. But there may be some drugs that we already have that we use for other purposes that can trigger these genes from upregulating. So in cells, he's shown, in the Petri dish, in human cells, he's shown that you can reverse genetic epigenetic age, and then in actual animals as well. So
That's pretty cool. And when it comes to, because there's so much out, I mean, there's so much out there when we look at longevity and what, the stuff that's coming up. I mean, I look at things, I don't get too much into the medicine side, but the holistic side I will,
yeah,
just because that's where my field's at.
sure,
But I do dabble into that side here and there. There is so much coming up. I'm just curious, with all the research and what you've been studying, what are some of the things on the medical side? Because when I looked at longevity years ago, I heard about like quantum beds and all these other cool stuff that
yeah,
that, that supposedly exists already, but it just hasn't, whatever, here stay there or there. But how that can literally stop the clock and turn it backwards.
yeah.
What are some, if there are out there, if you can share some of the stuff that's kind of already been in trials or studies, or just, that are kind of showing that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of like supplements or drugs that directly target these aging pathways, I think the one that probably has the most research behind it, multi animal models, is rapamycin. Of course, that's not a that's not a supplement. That actually is a drug that was used in organ transplant, and that's how it was really how I became familiar with it as a surgical resident rotating on transplant floors. But at low doses and pulsatile doses, that has been a big, very commonly used drug in the longevity community. The other major ones that you may have known is the things that increase the level of NAD, which is one of the big energy storage molecules in the body. So you may have NMN or NR. These are precursors to NAD. And it's thought, and I know Sinclair is a big advocate for this, that you can up regulate the amount of NAD in the body with this, and that triggers some pathways called the sirtuin pathways, which are part of these pathways, which I kind of alluded to earlier, that are part of that mechanism of aging.
Love it. Yeah, I was curious because, I mean, I've heard about the NAD being utilized, and the work of what that can do. How about, have you ever heard about anything with like exosomes and what they've been doing with those, and how?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that space is an interesting space. It's interesting because what the idea there really is to try to deliver. Uh, I think I don't know exosomes that well, but here's what my understanding is. So, a lot of people are doing these stem cells, for example, in Panama and that sort of thing, and they're apparently getting great, at least objectively great results. People feel great. There are a lot of injuries are being healed and things like that. Um, but if you talk to the guys even who are doing this, who are really the experts, it's not the stem cells themselves; it is the growth factors that seem to be around the stem cells that seem to decrease inflammation, to help healing, and all that stuff. And that is essentially my understanding is where the exosomes play. Um, that to me is a little bit different. It's a step off from what we're talking about, because there's one is the actual targeting of the aging process, right? And that's where rapamycin and NMN, I think some people talk about taurine, metformin, some of these other things come into play. There's the other part of this is really about health span and about actually decreasing or increasing our health now and optimizing our health now, which obviously plays into living a longer life as well. But it's not necessarily attacking the exact direct pathway of longevity that we've been talking about. It's equally important because, I think what you're getting at is some of these things like inflammation, right? Inflammation in the body is a massive, massive problem, and we call it inflammaging, right? Because there's all these things that happen in the body with inflammation that can lead to increased risk of cardiovascular disease and cancer and all and the things that kill us and ultimately decrease our longevity. So that's where things like exosomes, or frankly, a lot of basic diet, exercise, sleep, ideas come through and really play into the whole longevity thing.
I love it. Yeah, so it looks like, if I understand correctly, it's just looking at the perception or the focus of things, right? What you're talking about originally was like the aging process. What is that focusing there?
Yeah,
And these things help in a different realm with that, because there's so many. Like I said, there's so many things out there when it comes to longevity. That's why when I was saying heavy, I'm like, I'm curious to see where this piece of the puzzle is going to talk about and show
yeah,
up, and it's a different one than
yeah,
I've heard before. So
yeah,
that's why I appreciate it so much, and that's why I have so much questions. I'm like, okay, what's the drugs that are out there? What is this that's happening
yeah,
now? What's
of
this?
course.
Because I've had a couple other longevity experts on, and they all can't. You said the same thing. They said the same thing. Where it's like we're about a decade or two out from
Yeah,
turning that clock around,
yeah,
and it's just like cool. And my mind goes, okay, how are we doing that? Like, what's
yeah,
the? Because they had their own things are a little different. I've done my own stuff. I've had other people where we talked about things like the electron free radicals and using nanotechnology and things in the eke industry and what it can do. And I'm just like, okay, this is different. This is cool. I
yeah,
like different. I like out there stuff. Just to, so
yeah.
it's all. I think it's all pieces of the puzzle. But when we look directly at, then, is the focus strictly when it comes to aging, then in your studies and so forth, is it really looking just at the drug side itself and just seeing what we can do to do that, or are there other things too on top of it?
Well, here's the thing: is that, like, I think my overriding theme is that time is coming. Just like you mentioned, other people have said. I'm in the same. I have the same mindset. I believe that if you could stay healthy the next 10, 20 years, I think that we're going to have amazing technology that we can't even imagine what that looks like right now. However, in order to get to that time, we have to really optimize our health now. And that's really, I think, with my with my medical background, that's really kind of what I'm focused on. I keep up with all of the biochemistry and molecular biology, but at the end of the day, what we have a lot of low hanging fruit that we can deal with now, with diet, with exercise and sleep, and supplements as well. But there are simple things to do that if people can start adapting these types of changes in their life now, they're very likely, even if that scientific time doesn't come, that okay, the worst case scenario is you just added a decade of quality of life. That's not so bad either.
Yeah, you can't beat that, right?
Yeah, right.
Now, when it comes to looking at the aging process, though, do factors of disease play a role? Like, if you decrease the aging, or is that like, how does that all play a role?
Yeah. So, I mean, so ultimately, you know, I think, I guess let me try to understand your question specifically. Maybe you can rephrase that.
Yeah, I can rephrase it. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
So when we look at, like, aging, as the older we get, and the theme is like, oh, the older you get, you have all these issues, or it could be
Yeah.
arthritis, it could be, or it could be heart disease,
Yeah.
cardiovascular, cancer, you name that condition. When we look at aging, is aging
Hmm.
a product of that in some way, shape, or form? And if it is, when we look at the anti-aging aspect of things,
Mm.
will that help in that way, or is that
Yeah.
something different?
Well, I think the idea is that when we come to this, sort of golden age or whatever, that these diseases of aging that we have right now will become less likely to happen. They will happen with a lot less frequency because we are addressing the underlying problem. But in the meantime, we're not there. And so what we need to do is we need to address those low lying fruit or low hanging fruit now. I talk about, again, as a medical doctor, I can tell you right now, if you take the number one killer in the United States is cardiovascular disease, um, it shouldn't even be in the top 10. And we have so many tools to prevent cardiovascular. We know enough about it. And even if it progresses to a point where it does become a little bit worse, if we know about it, we can treat it early. So in some regards, I would say that the number one killer in the world right now, in the US, with all we have and all the knowledge we have and the scientific and the medical abilities that we have, you shouldn't die of cardiovascular disease. If you don't have it today, you shouldn't die of it. And And yet the reality is people will continue to do so. And it's because we're not taking advantage of what's already out there. And that's really kind of where, that's what I believe is, you look at, again, I'm looking at this very much on a data-driven, approach, but the things that cause cardiovascular disease generally is either hyperlipidemia and or inflammation, right? If you can really attack those two things, then you're not going to very likely have cardiovascular disease. It's as simple as that. So looking at some of these things logically and just thwarting them and avoiding them as much as you can and buying, healthy time between now and that, that golden period, that golden era is really what I think we can do. I really do.
I love it. And the only reason I was asking that question is because we were talking about turning back the clock on the cell.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my
Yes.
head, I was like, cells bind to, create tissues, go to organs. And I was like, I wonder if that would turn back that. And if there's something related to an age related or just XYZ, would that
Yeah.
also help?
Well, I think what you're getting at is important though, because what my point is that I think that, you have to maintain what you got, because we don't know, we don't, there's no reason to think that if we have damaged ourselves excessively by the time this period in time comes, that there's going to be anything to do for us, right? My belief is that you're going to have to come into that period of time pretty healthy, and that's what I'm really focused on.
No, I love it. I agree with you with that because you can't just go, oh, this is gonna be a miracle thing and everything's gonna take care of it. And I'm gonna be golden.
Right.
It's like you gotta have some good, about foundational principles when it comes to your health in order
Yeah.
to let that do its work and work its magic in some way, shape, or form. No, I love this. I could talk to you all day on this topic.
Sure.
There's so many more questions I could have.
Yeah.
But what is so you're looking at we're 10 to 20 years out.
Uh-huh.
What is the big thing that you're sharing right now when it comes to longevity and that kind of stuff? Because you have your business and stuff with that. What is the core principle that you utilize to help with longevity in that realm?
Yeah, so I think that some of it is going back to some basics of let's just talk about diet and exercise, right? Diet. I think if you focus on what's probably what's a few things that you can do to make sure that you're doing it right. I don't think that there's necessarily a magic diet per se. That's not what I'm advocating for. But what we do know is that, in terms of health, probably the most important things are really strict glycemic control. So blood sugar, keeping your blood sugar really controlled well. We have a lot of tools to do that. We have a lot of continuous glucose monitoring. We can, if people do have problems with blood sugar, they can be on medications like metformin. Um, you can figure out little cheat methods like apple cider vinegar before a meal, that kind of thing. So blood sugar is probably the single biggest enemy of longevity, spiking of blood sugar that there is. So targeting that is like number one, in my opinion. Making sure you get enough protein, right? And people who are obviously lifting and exercising a lot to build muscle know about that. But the problem is that muscle mass is extraordinarily important, not just for bodybuilders, but for everyone, because it's so heavily involved with glucose metabolism and the avoidance of metabolic syndromes and things like that. So there's that. I'm a big believer in time restricted feeding as well. I think if you look across the animal models, and there's a very consistent showing that some level of caloric restriction triggers these longevity genes to turn on. And so, we weren't meant to be eating 16 hours of the day, right? And so there's this concept called hormesis, and hormesis is what doesn't kill you, ultimately will make you stronger. We don't need to go into that extremes here, but if you have some period of time if the day, like say, say you're not taking in calories 16 hours of the day, that actually, tells your body, hey, there might be a little bit of stress here. Let's turn on those longevity genes to fight back, right? So there's diet, there's exercise. And when specifically, you look like you work out, Vic, but yeah, but most people don't. The whole idea of exercise, doctors just tell you to go home and eat well and exercise. But what does that even mean? There is longevity based exercise. We know that you need a certain high level of what's called level 2 cardiovascular exercise, which is basically 60 to 70% of your heart rate. We know that lifting, weight resistance training is incredibly important for, again, what we talked about with muscle mass, glucose control, and also as we get older, we lose huge amounts of muscle mass, right? And a lot of people end up dying, ultimately, particularly women, of hip fractures and sarcopenia. Sleep is another one. Yeah, people don't think about a lot about sleep, but sleep underlies poor sleep increases the risk of virtually every major killer out there. And we might even think we're having good sleep and not having good sleep. And so, I'm a big advocate for things like the Aura Ring or whatever other ways of looking at your sleep. There's two major types of sleep that I think people need to keep an eye on. One is deep non-REM sleep, and then there's REM sleep. Deep non-REM sleep is when the brain contracts in the middle of the night and kind of lets things wash away toxins. If you don't get enough of that, you're going to increase your risk of Alzheimer's disease. So again, there's so many low-hanging fruit there. There's so many ways we can intervene and not be passive in this whole, longevity experience. That's what I'm excited about just telling people about. So
No, I love it. You share a lot of stuff that I practice and utilize, and it's just how much can we activate those longevity genes and keep it rocking and rolling in that way.
Right.
And for the listeners, you do those kind of things, it'll help in long term. But even with I love the continuous glucose monitoring stuff, because it was funny. In my world, in the health world I'm in, like a lot of people are, eat, paleo, keto, carnivore. Like those are the big things. Minimize carbs all day long, yada yada yada. But I'm a different advocate. I'm all about just find what works for you, and you do what works for you, and test it. And don't just guess it, right? So one time I was like, I put one on for a month, and I was like, I'm gonna go 2 weeks keto, and then I'm gonna go 2 weeks. I'm Italian. I'm from, my whole entire family's from Italy. And so I was like, I'm going to go more sourdough, eating more carbs, like good carbs though, really good quality carbs. And I said, I want to see what happens to and add fruit. And I want to see what happens to my sugar levels. Now, you're a medical doctor. You would say, if you have more sugar, your sugar levels should go up and so forth. What I found fascinating was during the keto 2 weeks, my sugar levels were like at 100, 110, which is not, from the medical world, it's not bad, but from my world, it is. I was like, I don't like that. So I added more fruit and I started eating more carbs. And all of a sudden I'm like at 86, 84. And I'm just like, my sugar will go up, it'll come down really strong. And I was like, interesting. That's what works for me, I guess. And so since then
and I'm 100% on board with that, right? Like, I think the problem with just following these glycemic indices in food and having blind faith is that you're exactly right. We are, we all have sort of not only different types of faces and hair colors and eyes, but we also have different metabolisms. So what happens to one person is very different than another. Similarly to you, what I noticed is when I was using glucose monitor, like if I eat dinner, if I have protein first, and this is true, I think, for everybody, it's also about positioning of food. You don't start with the bread, right? You don't start with it. You start with the protein or the salad. The last thing you want to do is start attacking the bread that they bring out, when you go out is the first thing, because that's where you're going to get a spike. Now, but if you eat that bread later on in the meal or even dessert, what I found is like no spike, zero spike, right? And so what we're trying to avoid is those spikes, right? So we can either go off of just these numbers in the glycemic indices or start experimenting on ourselves. And that's what I'm advocating for, right? Like, it's really, um, we have lived in a world of medicine where it's always been about, doctors just telling us what we're supposed to do, and we listen. And that's, doctors, that's the way we were taught to do it. But we have so much technology. People need to be empowered into their own health and try to learn about their own bodies. I mean, how many people know about their own cars, right? How many guys know about their own cars and go and they're fix-it guys, but you can't do anything for your own body, right? So it seems to me that's kind of a no-brainer now that it's available.
I love it. Doc, how can people find you, follow you, and all the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so a couple ways. I mean, I've got the podcast. It's Sapio, Sapio, with Buck Joffrey, sapiopodcast.com. And there is a download there for just a quick book, because a lot of people don't have time. It's called Living Long for Busy People. So it's got a lot of these very basic concepts of diet, exercise, and sleep. If it's worthwhile to people, certainly download that. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
I appreciate it, Doc. Thanks for taking the time to come on and share all that you're up to, your research, what you're doing, and all that. It's a kind of cool frontier where we're heading into with the longevity stuff. So
Yeah.
I appreciate sharing the research you've been doing and all the stuff you've been following. And we'll see where it goes the next 10 to 20 years from now.
Yeah. Thanks, Vic.